They came at dawn, and not a single man reached for a weapon. Yet the whole town felt something heavier than fear settle in the dust. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere with wind like this, maybe, or somewhere far from it. Elias Boone stood alone on his porch, boots worn thin, the wood beneath him creaking like it remembered better days, and out beyond the broken fence line, past the stretch of dry land that hadn't seen rain in months, he saw them, shapes at first, moving through the early light, slow and steady, like they had nowhere else to be but right here. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, just a pale line cutting across the sky, and still the dust rose under their horses, soft, deliberate, measured in a way that made a man pay attention. Elias narrowed his eyes, one hand resting against the porch post, the other hanging loose by his side, empty, not reaching for anything, because something about the way they moved told him this wasn't a raid, wasn't trouble in the way he'd known trouble before. There were too many of them for that, dozens at least, maybe more beyond the ridge, and yet not one broke formation, not one rushed ahead, not one tried to claim the ground before the others. They rode like a single thought carried across miles. Behind him, the wind pushed through the cracks in the old house, rattling something loose inside, a hollow sound that matched the way the place looked now, forgotten, like the man standing in front of it. Folks in town had stopped saying his name years ago. To them, he was just that old rancher out past the dry creek, the one who never came in unless he had to, the one who lost more cattle than he sold, the one who didn't belong to anything anymore. He'd heard them laugh once. Two boys by the general store said he looked like a ghost that forgot how to leave. Elias didn't argue. Some things weren't worth the breath. The riders came closer, the distance shrinking from a mile to half, then less, and the details started to take shape. Leather, feathers, the quiet strength in the way they sat their horses, back straight, eyes forward. Apache. Elias felt the word before he said it in his head. It had been years since he'd seen any pass through this land, longer still since they had reason to stop. The fence at the edge of his property leaned crooked, a few posts missing, wire slack where it had snapped and never been fixed, and still the lead rider slowed just before crossing it, as if the boundary mattered, as if something here deserved respect. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. The second was what happened next. One by one, the riders came to a halt. No shouted orders. No raised hands. Just a quiet understanding that passed between them like breath. Horses settled. Dust drifted. And then no one moved. Elias stepped down from the porch, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, the dry dirt shifting under his weight. He walked a few paces forward, stopping just short of the fence line, close enough now to see their faces, their eyes, the stillness in them. He counted without meaning to, 10, 20, maybe 50, and more shapes lingering behind. Enough men to change the course of a day without ever saying a word. But they said nothing, just watched. The kind of watching that didn't judge, didn't threaten, just waited. Elias felt something stir in his chest, not fear, not yet, something older, harder to name. He'd seen men come with anger before. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. A moment stretched, then another. The sun crept higher, brushing gold across the edges of their shoulders, catching on bits of metal and beadwork, turning them into silhouettes carved out of light and shadow. And then, from the center of that silent line, one rider shifted. Just slightly. A woman. She swung down from her horse with an ease that spoke of years in the saddle, boots touching the ground without a sound, her posture steady, her gaze fixed on him like she had been looking for this place her whole life. Elias didn't recognize her. Not yet. But something in the way she stood there, calm, certain, carrying a weight that didn't belong to someone passing through, made the air feel different. Like the past had found its way back. And it had come a long way to do it. The woman did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than any words Elias had heard in years, the kind that made a man listen whether he wanted to or not. She took a few steps forward, slow enough that every movement seemed chosen, stopping just before the broken fence, as if the old wood and sagging wires still meant something, as if the line between them deserved to be honored even now. Elias watched her carefully, his eyes tracing the details without meaning to, the way her shoulders stayed level, the way her hands rested calm at her sides, not reaching for anything, not showing fear, not showing pride either, just certainty. He had seen that kind of presence before, but not in a long time, not out here where the land had a way of stripping people down to whatever they truly were. Behind her, the riders remained still, their horses quiet, their attention fixed but not tense, like they were waiting for something already decided. The wind shifted again, carrying the dry scent of dust and leather, brushing against Elias's face, lifting the edge of his coat, and for a moment he became aware of how small his world had grown. 30 acres of tired land, a house that leaned a little more each winter, a well that coughed up more air than water. He had stopped expecting anything from the horizon a long time ago. Nothing good ever came riding in from a distance. That was something a man learned if he stayed out here long enough. The woman's eyes met his then, steady, dark, holding something he could not place, not yet, and it unsettled him more than if she had come with anger or accusation. Those things he understood. This, he did not. He cleared his throat, the sound rough from disuse, and finally broke the quiet. "You are a long way from anywhere that matters," he said, his voice low, not unkind, just honest in the way men out here tended to be when there was no reason to pretend. The words hung between them, simple, but the woman did not take offense. If anything, there was the faintest shift in her expression, something like recognition, like she had expected him to say exactly that. She glanced once at the house behind him, the sagging roofline, the warped boards, the porch that had been repaired too many times with too little wood, and when her gaze returned to him, it softened, just a fraction, enough that he noticed. That was the second thing that did not make sense. No one looked at this place with softness anymore. "This place matters," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the distance without needing to rise, each word clear, measured, and certain. Elias felt that same stir in his chest again, stronger now, like something trying to surface through years of dust and silence. He shifted his weight slightly, boots grinding against the dirt, buying himself a second to think, but the truth was he had no idea what to make of any of this. Apache riders did not cross miles of open land to stand in front of a forgotten ranch for no reason. They did not stop at broken fences. They did not wait. And yet here they were. He glanced past her for a moment, counting again without thinking, noting the way some of the younger men watched him with curiosity rather than hostility, the way the older ones held themselves with a kind of quiet patience, as if they had seen enough of the world to know how moments like this unfolded. Then his gaze returned to her. "If you have business here," he said, slower this time, choosing each word with care, "you might as well say it." The wind eased, just slightly, as if the land itself leaned in to listen. The woman took one more step forward, closing the distance by a few feet, not enough to threaten, just enough to change the space between them, and then she did something that made Elias's breath catch without him understanding why. She reached into the fold of her clothing and drew out a small object, worn, simple, something that had seen years of weather and time, and held it in her palm where he could see it clearly. From where he stood, it was only a shape at first, a hint of leather, something braided, something familiar in a way that did not make sense yet. Elias frowned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward just a fraction, trying to bring it into focus, trying to pull it out of the fog of memory that had settled over most of his life. He felt it then, not as a thought, not as a memory, but as a weight, something pressing quietly against the inside of his chest, like a door that had been closed for too long beginning to shift. The woman did not rush him. She simply held the object there, steady in her hand, her gaze never leaving his face, watching, waiting, as if she already knew what he would see when the past finally caught up with him. The leather in her hand caught the first full light of morning, and that was when Elias saw it clearly, not just the shape but the stitching, the way it had been braided by careful fingers, the small knot at the end where the thread had been tied off instead of cut, and something inside him shifted so suddenly he forgot to breathe. His eyes locked onto it, the rest of the world pulling back, the riders, the wind, the dry land, all of it fading into a quiet hum as memory moved in without asking permission. He took one step forward, then stopped, as if crossing that last bit of distance would make it too real, as if it would demand something from him he was not ready to give. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and this time his voice carried something different, something softer, worn thin by years he had not spoken about. The woman did not look down at the bracelet, did not need to, her fingers holding it with a familiarity that told its own story. "You gave it to me," she said, simple, steady, as if there had never been any doubt. The words settled between them, and for a moment Elias just stood there, the weight in his chest pressing harder now, turning into something he could not ignore. He shook his head once, slow, not in denial, but in disbelief, like a man trying to place a face in a crowd he had not seen in years. "No," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I would remember." But even as he spoke, the edges of that certainty began to fray. The woman took another step closer, still not crossing the broken fence, still honoring that invisible line, and lifted the bracelet just slightly, enough that the light caught on the worn leather, enough that the details sharpened, and with them came something else. Cold air. Not the dry heat of morning, but a different cold, the kind that bit through fabric and settled in bone. Elias felt it before he saw it, the memory rising like breath on a winter night. Snow. The sound of it under boots, soft but urgent. A sky heavy with clouds. He closed his eyes for half a second, and in that space the past opened without asking. He saw the ridge again, the way the land dipped toward the creek, the way the wind had carried a sound that did not belong to the quiet, a small voice, thin, breaking through distance. He had not planned to follow it. Men like him learned not to chase every sound across open land. But he had. He had taken his rifle, pulled his coat tighter, and gone anyway, because something in that voice had not let him stand still. The woman's voice brought him back, but not all the way. "I was 8, she said, and now there was something beneath her calm, something that did not show in her posture, but lived in the way she chose each word. "The snow was deeper than my knees. I could not find the path back." Elias's eyes opened slowly, and when they met hers again, there was recognition there now, faint, uncertain, but growing. He did not see the chief yet. He saw a child, small, frightened, standing where the land dropped off near the creek, wrapped in a coat too thin for the cold, her hands clenched tight, like she was holding onto the last bit of warmth she had. He swallowed once, the motion visible in his throat, and the rest of the memory followed without asking. The way he had moved closer, slow, careful, not wanting to startle her. The way she had looked at him, not with trust, not yet, but with something close to it because there had been no one else. He remembered the moment he had taken off his glove and held out his hand, palm open, nothing hidden, just an offer. He had said something then, something simple, something a man says when words do not matter as much as tone. He could not remember the exact words now, but he remembered the way she had hesitated, then stepped forward, placing her small hand in his. The bracelet had come later. He saw that now too. Sitting by the fire in his cabin, the wind pressing against the walls, the smell of smoke and damp wool filling the space. He had found the strip of leather in a drawer, something left over from a repair, and without thinking too much about it, he had braided it slowly, his hands moving out of habit, giving the child something to hold on to that was not fear. He had tied it around her wrist himself, not as a promise, not as anything grand, just a quiet gesture meant to steady a night that had come too close to breaking. Elias exhaled, long and slow, the sound almost lost to the wind, and when he looked at her again, he was no longer searching for where he had seen her. He knew. The years had changed her, carved strength into her posture, into her voice, into the way she stood in front of him now with 100 riders behind her, but the eyes had not changed. "Nayeli," he said, the name coming back to him like it had been waiting just beneath the surface all along. And for the first time since they arrived, something in the air shifted, not in the riders, not in the land, but in the space between two people who had once shared a night neither of them had forgotten. Nayeli did not smile when he spoke her name, but something in her eyes shifted, a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words, the kind that carried years inside it without ever asking to be explained. She lowered the bracelet slightly, not hiding it, just letting it rest against her palm as if its purpose had already been fulfilled, and for a moment neither of them moved, the distance between them filled with everything that had happened and everything that had not. Elias felt the weight of that night settle fully into place now, not as fragments, not as a distant memory, but as something whole again, something that had never really left him, only buried under days that all looked the same. He let out a slow breath and glanced past her, at the riders behind, at the number of them, at the way they watched him not with suspicion but with something closer to respect, and that unsettled him more than anything else had so far. "You came a long way for a memory," he said, the words quiet, measured, carrying the kind of distance a man builds when he does not know what is expected of him. Naeli tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that did not feel like judgment, more like recognition, as if she was measuring not what he had become, but what had remained. "Not for a memory," she replied, her voice steady. "For a debt." The word hung there, simple, but it did not sit right with Elias. He shook his head once, a small motion firm. "I did not do anything worth 100 riders crossing miles of land," he said. "I saw a child in the cold. I brought her inside. That is all." Naeli took another step forward, and this time she stopped with her hand resting lightly against one of the broken fence posts, her fingers brushing the worn wood like she understood something about it that others would not. "That is not all," she said, and there was something deeper in her voice now, not louder, just rooted. "You stayed." Elias frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in confusion. "Stayed," he echoed. Naeli nodded once, her gaze steady on his. "You could have taken me to the edge of your land and turned back," she said. "You could have told yourself someone else would find me. You could have decided it was not your concern." She paused just long enough for the weight of those choices to settle, then continued, "But you did not. You built a fire. You waited. You made sure I could stand when the sun came back." Elias felt something tighten in his chest again, not from the memory itself, but from the way she held it, like it had mattered more than he had ever allowed himself to think. He looked down briefly, his boot nudging a small stone in the dirt, then back up at her. "That was one night," he said quietly. Naeli's eyes did not leave his. "One night can decide the rest of a life," she answered. The wind moved through the space between them again, softer now, carrying less dust, as if the land itself had settled into listening. Behind her, one of the older riders shifted slightly in his saddle, not impatient, just present, and Elias became aware again of how many of them there were, how far this moment reached beyond the two of them. He straightened a little, his shoulders squaring out of habit more than intent, and glanced once toward the house. Behind him, the porch, the door that had not seen a visitor in years, then back to her. "If you came to settle something," he said, "you might as well say it plain." Naeli followed his glance to the house, her eyes taking in the details he no longer saw, the repairs made from scraps, the roofline dipping slightly, the quiet signs of a man who had kept going without expecting help. When she looked back at him, there was no pity there, only clarity. "Men from town came here yesterday," she said. Elias's jaw tightened just a fraction, the smallest sign that the words had landed where she expected. "They come often enough," he replied. "They talk. They leave." Naeli shook her head once, slow. "Not this time." The air shifted again, heavier now, not with threat, but with something approaching it. Elias held her gaze, waiting, and for the first time since she arrived, there was a pause in her certainty, not doubt, but the space before something that could not be taken back. "They will return before the sun is high," she said, "and they will not come to talk." Elias did not ask how she knew. Out here, a man learned when information was given and when it was earned. He simply nodded once, his expression settling into something older, something that had seen enough to understand what was being said without needing it spelled out. "Then I suppose this is where your road and mine part ways," he said, not dismissive, just practical, like a man who had already decided how much of himself he was willing to risk. Naeli watched him for a long moment, the silence stretching again, but this time it carried a different weight, something closer to decision. Then, without turning back to her riders, without raising her voice, she spoke one sentence, quiet, certain, and final. "No," she said, "this is where they begin to cross." The words settled into the morning like dust after a long ride, quiet but impossible to ignore, and for a moment Elias did not move, did not answer, just stood there with the weight of them pressing against everything he had learned about how the world worked. Roads did not cross out here unless someone forced them to, and even then, they rarely stayed that way. He looked at Naeli, really looked this time. Not as the child from his memory, not as a stranger with riders at her back, but as something in between, something that carried both past and present without asking permission from either. "You do not know what you are stepping into," he said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying no warning, just truth. Naeli did not hesitate. "I do," she replied, and there was no sharpness in it, no challenge, just certainty shaped by years he had not seen. Behind her, one of the riders shifted his horse forward a few inches, not breaking formation, just adjusting, and that small movement rippled outward, subtle, controlled, like water responding to a stone. Elias noticed it. Of course he did. A man who had spent his life reading small changes in the land did not miss something like that, and it told him more than words could have. These were not men waiting for orders. They were men who already understood them. He exhaled slowly and turned his head slightly, glancing toward the horizon beyond the ridge, where the light had fully broken now, turning the sky pale and wide. Somewhere out there, the town would already be awake. Boots on wood, doors opening, voices carrying, and men who believed the land beneath his feet no longer belonged to him would be preparing to prove it. He had seen that kind of preparation before. Papers folded into coats, promises spoken like they meant something, numbers written down that did not account for the weight of a life lived on a piece of ground. He did not fear it. Not anymore. But he understood it. "They will come with words first," he said, more to himself than to her. "And then with something heavier when words do not work." Naeli listened without interrupting, her gaze following his for a moment toward the horizon, as if she could already see what he described. "Then we will meet them with something they do not expect," she said. Elias let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh once, long ago, before the years wore that kind of sound away. "Out here," he said, turning back to her, "men expect everything except silence." Naeli's expression shifted just slightly at that, not into a smile, but into something close to understanding. She stepped back from the fence then, just one pace, and for the first time since she arrived, she turned her head toward the riders behind her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. A single look passed between them, and it was enough. One by one, the riders began to move, not forward, not toward Elias, but outward, spreading along the edge of the property with quiet precision, creating space rather than closing it, their horses stepping carefully over uneven ground, their presence forming something that was not a wall, not a threat, but a boundary drawn without a single word spoken. Elias watched it happen, the shape of it, the intention behind it, and something in him recognized it for what it was. Not an act of force, an act of protection. That was the third thing that did not make sense. He had not asked for it. He had not earned it, not in any way he could measure. And yet it was happening all the same. He shifted his weight again, the old habit of grounding himself when the world moved in ways he could not predict, and his eyes drifted back to the house, to the door that had stayed closed for so long. He thought about the fire inside, the way it used to crackle when wood was easy to find, the way the place had once felt like something more than shelter. Then he looked back at Naeli. "This will not end the way you think," he said quietly. Naeli met his gaze without hesitation. "It already has," she answered. The wind moved again, carrying a new sound this time, faint at first, then clearer, the distant rhythm of hooves against dry ground, uneven, faster than the measured approach from before, the kind of movement that did not care about dust or distance, only about arrival. Elias heard it, and did not turn right away. He did not need to. He knew that sound. He had been waiting for it longer than he had realized. After a moment, he shifted his eyes toward the ridge, the line where the land dipped and rose again. And there they were, just shapes for now, smaller than the riders who stood behind him, but moving with a different kind of urgency. Men who believed they were coming to finish something. He nodded once, almost to himself. "They are early," he said. Naeli did not look. Surprised. She stepped forward again, back to the fence, back to him, the bracelet still resting in her hand, the past and present held together in something small enough to forget, but strong enough to return. "No," she said softly, her voice steady as the ground beneath them. "They are right on time." The sound of hooves grew louder, breaking the stillness in a way that did not belong to the quiet order behind Elias. And when the riders from town crested the ridge, they came fast, careless with the land, dust kicking up in uneven bursts beneath their horses, as if urgency alone could claim what they believed was theirs. Elias watched them approach without moving, his posture steady, his hands empty, his eyes calm in a way that came from years of seeing the same kind of moment dressed in different faces. There were 5 of them, maybe 6 if you counted the man riding slightly behind, the one who let others speak first, but always made the final decision. Elias recognized him even at a distance. Thomas Grady. Clean coat, straight posture, the kind of man who believed ownership could be written and enforced, that land listened to paper more than to memory. The group slowed as they neared the property line, their horses shifting under them, sensing something different before their riders did, the presence of the Apache already changing the air. Grady's gaze moved across the spread of riders standing along the edge, his expression tightening just slightly, not fear, not yet, but calculation adjusting to a new piece on the board. He pulled his horse to a stop about 20 yards from the fence, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to keep distance where it still mattered. "Boone," he called out, his tone even, practiced, like this was just another visit, another step in a process he had already decided the outcome of. Elias did not answer right away. He let the silence stretch, not as a challenge, just as something natural, the way the land often spoke slower than men expected. Finally, he nodded once. "Grady," he said, his voice carrying across the space without effort. Grady's eyes flicked briefly to Nayeli, taking in her presence, her stillness, the riders behind her, then back to Elias. "Looks like you have company," he said, a faint edge under the words. Something he had not planned for. Elias followed his glance, then returned it. "Seems that way," he replied. "No more, no less." Grady shifted slightly in his saddle, one hand resting against the front of it, not reaching for anything, just grounding himself as he adjusted. "We came to settle what we discussed," he continued, his voice steady again, leaning into familiarity, into routine, as if that could smooth over what stood in front of him. "You have had time. The offer stands. It is fair." Elias did not look at him immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted to the ground between them, to the dry earth that had held his weight for years, that had taken every step he had made without complaint. "Fair to who?" he asked quietly. Grady exhaled through his nose, a small sign of impatience he did not bother to hide. "Fair by law," he said. "The papers are clear. This land is no longer under your claim. We are giving you a chance to leave with something rather than nothing." Elias lifted his eyes then, meeting Grady's gaze without heat, without resistance, just presence. "I have been here longer than your papers," he said. Grady gave a small shake of his head, almost sympathetic. "That is not how the world works anymore." The words settled into the air, familiar, repeated, the kind of truth men like Grady carried with them wherever they went. Behind Elias, the wind moved lightly through the dry grass. Behind Grady, the riders shifted, waiting for direction. And between them, something else stood now, something Grady could not fold into his understanding of how things should go. Nayeli stepped forward, not past the fence, not into his space, but enough that her presence could not be ignored. And when she spoke, she did not raise her voice, did not interrupt. She simply added something to the moment that had not been there before. "This land is not empty," she said. Grady's eyes moved to her again, sharper this time, measuring, assessing, trying to place her within the boundaries he understood. "And you are," he replied, "not part of this discussion." Nayeli did not react to the dismissal. She stood as she had before, calm, grounded, her gaze steady. "You see lines on paper," she said. "We see where a man chose to stay when he could have walked away." Grady's jaw tightened just slightly, the first crack in the smooth surface he carried. "This is not about stories," he said. "It is about ownership." Elias remained still, listening, the words passing over him like wind over rock, but something in the space had changed, something that no longer belonged to Grady alone. Nayeli glanced once toward the riders along the edge of the land, then back to him. "Ownership," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word itself, then let it fall into the silence between them. For a moment, no one spoke. The dust settled, the horses stilled, and the morning held its breath, waiting to see which kind of truth would stand when the words ran out. Grady's eyes lingered on Nayeli now, no longer dismissing her, no longer certain where she stood in the order of things he believed he controlled, and that uncertainty, small as it was, shifted the balance more than any raised voice could have. He straightened slightly in his saddle, drawing in a measured breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes the ground beneath him is not as firm as it seemed a moment ago. "You speak like this is your concern," he said, his tone calm but tighter now, as if he was adjusting his footing in real time. Naeli did not move. The bracelet still rested in her hand, the leather worn smooth by years, catching the light just enough to remind anyone looking that time had passed, but not erased what came before. "It is," she answered, simple, without emphasis, as if the truth did not need decoration. Grady's gaze flicked once more across the riders stretched along the property line, taking in their stillness, their silence, the absence of threat, and yet the presence of something far more difficult to define. He was a man used to resistance, used to raised voices, to anger, to fear. Those things could be managed. This quiet did not give him anything to push against. "This land," he said, returning his attention to Elias, choosing familiarity again, choosing the path he understood, was surveyed, recorded, and reassigned. That is the law. It does not bend for stories or sentiment. Elias listened without interrupting, his face unchanged, the lines there carved by years of sun and wind, not by argument. He had heard words like these before, from men who came and went, from voices that believed certainty could be spoken into existence. He did not argue with them then. He did not argue now. "Maybe it does not," he said quietly, "but I stayed anyway." The words were not defiant. They were not meant to win anything. They were simply true. And in that truth, something shifted again, subtle but real, like the land itself acknowledging a weight it recognized. Naeli watched Elias as he spoke, and for a moment, the leader, the woman who stood at the head of many, gave way to something quieter, something that remembered a fire in a small cabin, a man who had chosen to remain when it would have been easier to turn away. Then she looked back at Grady, and when she spoke again, there was a new layer beneath her voice, not louder, not sharper, but anchored in something older than paper. 15 winters ago," she said, "a man found a child on this land. He did not ask who she belonged to. He did not ask what he would gain. He did not measure her worth against his own." Grady's expression hardened slightly, not from anger, but from resistance, from a refusal to let the conversation move beyond the lines he understood. "And that has nothing to do with ownership," he replied. Naeli tilted her head just a fraction, studying him, not as an enemy, not as something to be defeated, but as something to be understood. "It has everything to do with it," she said. "Because you believe ownership is something you take. We believe it is something you carry." The words settled into the space between them, and for the first time since he arrived, Grady did not answer immediately. The riders behind him shifted slightly, their horses restless now, picking up on the tension that had no clear direction, and one of the men glanced toward Grady, waiting, expecting a command that did not come. Elias stood still, saying nothing, his presence unchanged, but the space around him no longer felt empty. It held something now, something that had been given, not claimed. Naeli took one final step forward, close enough now that the broken fence was the only thing separating them, her hand lowering, the bracelet hanging loosely from her fingers, and her voice, when she spoke, was softer than before, but carried further. "You see a man alone," she said. "We see a man who was not." Grady's jaw tightened, his gaze moving from her to Elias and back again, searching for something he could use, something he could define, but finding only a stillness that did not answer to him. "You cannot change the law," he said, though there was less certainty in it now. Naeli nodded once, accepting the statement without argument. "No," she said, "but we can decide what we stand beside." The wind moved again, carrying the sound of quiet breath, of shifting leather, of 100 small things that together made something larger than any one voice. And in that moment, without a signal, without a command, the riders along the edge of the land did something that no paper could account for. One by one, they dismounted, boots touching the ground in a slow, deliberate rhythm, each man stepping forward just enough to stand, not advancing, not surrounding, just present, their eyes forward, their bodies still, forming a line that did not threaten, did not push, but did not yield either. Elias felt it then, not as pressure, not as protection forced upon him, but as something offered, something that stood beside him without asking anything in return. He did not turn to look at them. He did not need to. He simply stood there, facing Grady, the same man he had been before they arrived, and yet not alone anymore in a way that no one had seen coming. Grady felt it before he understood it, the shift in the air that had nothing to do with numbers or law or the kind of authority he carried in his coat pocket. Something quieter, something that did not answer to him. And for the first time since he rode onto this land, he did not look like a man in control of the outcome. His gaze moved across the line of Apache riders now standing on the ground, not mounted, not advancing, just present in a way that filled the space without crowding it. And the longer he looked, the clearer it became that this was not a show of force, not something meant to intimidate, but something far more difficult to challenge. It was a decision. He shifted in his saddle again, the leather creaking softly beneath him, and glanced at the men behind him, catching the uncertainty there, the way one of them tightened his grip on the reins, the way another avoided looking directly at the line of figures now standing across the property. They had expected resistance, maybe an argument, maybe a raised voice they could push back against, but not this. Not silence that stood its ground. Grady turned his attention back to Elias, searching his face for something that would give him an edge, some sign that the man in front of him was still alone in the way he had been yesterday, but that sign was gone. Elias had not moved. He had not stepped forward or back. He had not spoken another word. And yet the space around him had changed in a way Grady could not undo. "You think this changes anything?" Grady said, his voice steady but thinner now, like it had to work harder to hold its shape. Elias did not answer. He did not need to. Nayeli stepped into that space instead, her presence calm, her posture unchanged, her voice when it came softer than before, but carrying further than any shout could have. "It does not change what you believe," she said. "It changes what you can do." The words landed clean, without weight added, without force, and that made them harder to push aside. Grady's jaw tightened again, but this time it held something closer to recognition than resistance. He looked once more at the riders, at the way they stood without threat, without motion, and something in his calculation shifted again, not toward fear, but toward understanding the limits of what he could enforce without consequence. He exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the morning air, and for a moment, the man who believed in papers and lines and signatures stood face to face with something that did not fit inside any of those things. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, though the words lacked the certainty they had carried before. Nayeli shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet correction. "No," she replied. "We are making it clear." The wind moved again, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant heat, and in that moment, the land felt larger than it had before, as if it was no longer contained by the lines men tried to draw across it. Grady looked down briefly, his gloved hand brushing against the front of his saddle, then back up, his gaze settling on Elias one last time. "You will not win this," he said, but it sounded less like a warning now and more like something he had told himself many times before. Elias met his eyes, calm, steady, unchanged. "I am not trying to," he answered quietly. That was the moment something gave way, not in the land, not in the people standing on it, but in the space inside Grady where certainty had lived. He held Elias's gaze for a second longer, then another, and then he looked away first. It was a small thing. Most would not have noticed it. But out here, small things carried weight. He drew in a breath, straightened in his saddle, and turned his horse slightly, not fully away, just enough to break the line between them. "We will revisit this," he said, the words returning to something more familiar, something procedural, something that allowed him to step back without admitting he already had. Elias did not respond. Nayeli did not move. The riders remained as they were. And that silence followed Grady as he turned fully now, guiding his horse back toward the ridge, the men behind him falling in one by one, their departure quicker than their arrival, dust rising again under their hooves, but this time carrying something different with it. Not certainty, not control, something quieter, something unfinished. Elias watched them go without expression, his eyes following the shapes as they grew smaller against the horizon, until they became nothing more than movement in the distance. Only then did the air begin to settle again, the tension easing not all at once, but in slow, steady breaths. Behind him, The house stood as it had before. Around him, the land remained unchanged. But the silence now, it was not the same as the one that came before. The dust settled slowly after the riders disappeared beyond the ridge, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty. And Elias stood where he had been all along, boots planted in the same worn patch of ground. But the weight on his shoulders no longer belonged to a man waiting for something to be taken from him. He watched the horizon a moment longer than necessary, as if making sure they were truly gone. Then let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, the sound quiet, almost lost to the wind. Behind him, the old house creaked again, the same familiar sound, unchanged, and yet it felt different now, like it was no longer standing alone in the wide stretch of land. He turned slightly, not toward the house, but toward the line of riders still standing where they had placed themselves, their presence steady, unbroken, their purpose already fulfilled without a single command given. Nayeli remained near the fence, the bracelet still resting in her hand, though now it hung loosely, its meaning no longer something that needed to be proven. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left that required words. Elias stepped forward, closing the distance to the fence, his hand coming to rest on one of the weathered posts, fingers tracing the cracks in the wood as if grounding himself in something real, something that had not shifted with the morning. He looked at Nayeli, not as a stranger, not as a chief, but as someone who had once stood in his doorway with snow in her hair and fear in her eyes. "You did not have to come back," he said quietly. Nayeli met his gaze, her expression calm, but there was something softer there now, something that belonged to neither the past nor the present, but to the space between them. "You did not have to stay," she replied. The words settled between them, simple, balanced, carrying the same weight in both directions, and Elias gave a small nod, accepting them in the only way he knew how. He glanced once at the bracelet, then back at her. "I forgot about that," he admitted. Nayeli shook her head gently. "No," she said. "You let it go? That is different." Elias considered that for a moment, then let it pass, not arguing, not agreeing, just letting the truth sit where it belonged. He looked out across the land again, the dry grass, the broken fence line, the stretch of earth that had taken everything he had given it and asked for more, and for the first time in years, it did not feel like something he was holding on to alone. Behind Nayeli, one of the older riders shifted slightly, then another, the line loosening not in purpose, but in tension, the moment that had brought them here reaching its quiet end. Nayeli turned her head just enough to acknowledge them, a small motion, and it was enough. One by one, they began to move, not in haste, not in disorder, but with the same quiet intention they had arrived with, returning to their horses, gathering the space back into themselves without leaving anything unsettled behind. Elias watched them, not with surprise now, but with a kind of understanding that came slowly, like water finding its level. When he looked back at Nayeli, she was still there, still standing at the fence, as if there was one last thing the moment required. She stepped closer, just enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier, and then she did something that neither demanded attention nor avoided it. She placed the bracelet gently on the fence post between them, letting it rest there in the open, not returning it, not keeping it, simply leaving it where both past and present could see it. Elias's eyes followed the movement, settling on the worn leather, the small knot at the end, the quiet proof of something that had never needed to be remembered to remain true. He did not reach for it. He did not need to. Nayeli met his gaze one last time, and in that look there was no debt left, no balance to be settled, only recognition, the kind that does not ask for thanks. Then she turned, smooth and certain, and walked back toward her horse, mounting without a sound, her posture steady as it had been when she arrived. The riders gathered around her, forming once more into something that moved as one, and without a word, they began to ride, not away from him, but forward into their own path, the dust rising again, softer this time, carried by a wind that no longer felt empty. Elias remained where he was, his hand still resting on the fence, his eyes on the bracelet as the sound of hooves faded into the distance. He stood there long after they were gone, the land stretching out in every direction, the house behind him, the horizon ahead, and in the quiet that followed, there was no victory, no loss, no need to name what had happened. Just the simple, steady truth that out here, Some things did not belong to the men who claimed them, but to the ones who chose to stay and the ones who chose to remember.